Sarah arrived 12 minutes late. I know it was 12 minutes because Norma had been tracking it since 10 o'clock, announced it twice, and made a comment about punctuality that I chose not to engage with, given that Norma herself arrives at whatever time she decides to arrive and has never once acknowledged the contradiction. Carol was at the table. She had brought more cookies. The recipe was improving, she said. She had figured out the vanilla situation. Richard, she suspected, had meant a full extra teaspoon rather than the modest adjustment she had been attempting. She was right. They were noticeably better. Norma had already eaten 3. At 10:12, the back door opened, and a woman in her early 40s came in with the specific energy of someone who has agreed to something they weren't entirely sure about, and has decided to honor the agreement despite the uncertainty. She was tall like Carol. She had her mother's composure, but carrying it differently, where Carol's composure was settled. Sarah's was maintained. There is a distinction between those two things, and it was visible immediately. She looked around the kitchen. She looked at me, at Norma, at the fake succulent and the cactus on the windowsill, at her mother at the table with the cookie container open in front of her. She said, "This is the kitchen." Carol said, "This is the kitchen." Sarah said, "It's a nice kitchen." Norma said, "He doesn't have enough coffee filters. I've mentioned it multiple times." Sarah looked at Norma. Norma said, "I'm Norma. I live next door. I've been coming here on Tuesdays for 3 years. I'm essentially a fixture." Sarah said, "My mother mentioned you." Norma said, "Good things, I hope." Carol said, very carefully, "I said you were a character." Norma said, "I'll take it." Sarah sat down. She accepted a cup of coffee and a cookie, and she sat with her hands around the cup in the way of someone using warmth as a grounding mechanism. And she looked at her mother with the expression I had been told to expect. The careful, loving, slightly exhausted expression of a woman who has spent 14 months being worried about someone she loves and is not entirely sure that what she is worried about is what she should be worried about. We talked about light things for a while. Her job, she worked in hospital administration, which produced a brief professional conversation between us that Norma interrupted twice with questions that had nothing to do with hospital administration. Her children, 2 of them, 9 and 11, who had adored their grandfather and who asked about him regularly, which Sarah described with a complicated expression that I filed away to return to. And then, about 30 minutes in, Norma stood up and said she needed to check on something at her house and left. Sarah watched her go. She said, "Does she always do that?" I told her Norma had many qualities, and subtlety was not among them, but that her instincts were generally sound. Sarah looked at her mother, then at me. She said, "She told me you've been helpful to my mother since my father died." I told her Carol had been helpful to me as well, that the exchange ran in both directions. She nodded. Then she said, with the directness of someone who has decided to say the thing rather than approach it gradually, "I told my mother to stop talking about my father so much. She told you that." I told her Carol had mentioned it. She said, "I need you to understand that I said it because I was scared, not because I didn't love my father, not because I wanted my mother to pretend he hadn't existed." She looked at her coffee. I said it because every time she talked about him, she cried, and I couldn't fix the crying. And I have spent my entire adult life being able to fix things for my mother, and I could not fix this, and it was. She stopped. She said it was unbearable to watch, and I said the wrong thing because of it. There was a silence. Carol reached across the table and put her hand over Sarah's. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand there, and I thought, There it is. That's the whole thing. Right there at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. A daughter who said the wrong thing because she couldn't bear to watch her mother suffer, and a mother who forgave it with a single gesture before her daughter finished the sentence. What Sarah said that changed the conversation. We stayed at that table for a long time. Norma came back after about 20 minutes, took one look at the room, made a sound that was her version of, "I see what's happening here," poured herself more coffee, and sat down quietly in the corner chair. This is the most restrained I have ever seen Norma behave in 22 years of knowing her, and I want to note it formally, because it may not happen again. Sarah talked. Not about her father initially, about herself. About what the 14 months had been like from where she was standing, which was a position I had thought about but had not. I realized fully understood. The position of the person who loves the grieving person, but is not the grieving person. The person on the outside of the loss, who is experiencing something real and significant, and who has no culturally recognized name for what they are going through. She said, "Everyone asked how my mother was doing. For months, every conversation. How is Carol? How is she holding up?" And I would say she's doing well, or she's having a hard week, or whatever the honest answer was. And people would say, that must be so hard for her. And I would agree. She paused. She said, "Nobody asked how I was doing." And I don't mean that as a complaint. My father died, not my husband. The grief hierarchy is clear and I understood it. But I lost my father. I lost 43 years of Sunday dinners and phone calls, and the specific, irreplaceable experience of being someone's daughter. And that was happening at the same time I was trying to be what my mother needed, and I had nowhere to put my own version of it. She looked at me, she said, and then I would sit with my mother while she talked about my father, and she would cry and I would want to cry too, but I couldn't because I was the one who was supposed to be holding it together. And eventually the pressure of holding it together expressed itself as the worst possible thing I could have said. She said, "Stop talking about him so much. It's not healthy." She said it the way you say a thing. You've regretted for months, flat. Without the intonation it would have carried in the original moment, stripped of whatever combination of fear and love and inadequacy had produced it. Carol said quietly, "I knew what you meant." Sarah said, "I know you did. I know that. But I still should not have said it." Carol said, "No, you shouldn't have." They looked at each other across the table with the specific honesty of a mother and a daughter who have arrived after 14 months of managed conversations at the actual one. I stayed very still, because what was happening at my kitchen table was something I had watched happen in hospital consultation rooms across 40 years. The moment when two people who love each other stop performing their best selves for each other and speak instead from the interior of what they are actually carrying. It is not always comfortable. It is almost always necessary. And it produces something that the performance, however well-intentioned, never can. It produces the beginning of real repair. What I told Sarah about the person on the outside. After a while, Carol excused herself to use the restroom, and Sarah and I sat for a few minutes in the particular quiet of two people who have just witnessed something significant together. She said, "My mother talks about you, about the things you've said in these conversations." She told me about Margaret, about the 30 years and the 8 months and the letter. I told her Carol had been generous in sharing those conversations, she said. She told me you said something about how grief is the relationship with the person you lost, transformed by their absence, that it doesn't expire. I told her that was roughly what I had said. She said, I want to ask you something about the people on the outside, the ones who aren't the widow or the widower, who are carrying their own version of it and don't have a name for what they're carrying. I told her to ask. She said, "Is it acceptable to grieve your father the way you grieve your husband? Is the weight supposed to be the same? Because I feel like I've been apologizing for the size of what I feel since the day he died, because my mother's loss is clearly larger, and I don't want to make her loss smaller by placing mine next to it." And this question, which I had heard in various forms across 40 years from the children and siblings and friends of people I had treated, this question had never landed with quite this weight before. Because Sarah was sitting across from me at my kitchen table, with her mother's cookies between us and her mother in the next room. And she was 43 years old, and she had lost her father, and she had been apologizing for the size of her grief for 14 months, because she understood the hierarchy and had accepted her place in it. I want to tell you what I told her, because I think it is something that a significant number of people need to hear and almost never do. The hierarchy of grief and why it causes so much damage. Grief has a cultural hierarchy. We do not discuss this hierarchy openly. It exists in the invisible architecture of how we respond to loss in other people, in the assumptions we make about which losses require the most support and the longest recovery and the most protected space. At the top of the hierarchy, in American culture, is the loss of a spouse, then a child, then a parent, then a sibling, then a friend. The hierarchy is not official. It has not been written anywhere and codified, but it operates with remarkable consistency in how people are treated when they lose someone, and in how people treat themselves. Sarah had placed herself at the appropriate level of the hierarchy. She was a daughter, not a spouse. Her father had died, not her husband. She was at a lower level than Carol, and she had, with the specific discipline of someone who takes the cultural hierarchy seriously, been constraining her grief to the size appropriate to her level. The grief had not cooperated with this constraint. Grief does not accept containment based on relationship category. Grief is proportional not to the type of relationship, but to the depth of it, the duration of it, the specific texture of what you built with the person, and what you have lost with their absence. Richard was in Sarah's life for 43 years. He was her first experience of what a man could be, of what a marriage could look like, of what it meant to be chosen by and to choose another person for a lifetime. He was the person she called when something good happened, when something went wrong, when she needed to think through a problem. He was the person who came to every school event and then every professional milestone, and who kept track, in whatever internal register fathers keep, of every version of her as she grew. His death was not a small loss, because he was her father rather than her husband. His death was the loss of 43 years of that specific, irreplaceable relationship. And the grief appropriate to that loss is whatever size it actually is, not the size the hierarchy assigns. I told her this. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My therapist has said some version of this, but hearing it from someone who has been where my mother is, who is on the inside of the larger loss, it lands differently." I told her I was glad it landed. She said, "Can I ask you something else?" I told her she could. She said, "My father and I had something similar to what you described with Margaret. Not as long. He didn't have 40 years of absence, but there were things between us that we never said. He was not a demonstrative man. He was loving, but not verbal about it. And She stopped. I think I learned his language instead of teaching him mine. I met him where he was for 43 years, and I have spent 14 months wondering if he knew how I felt. I thought about Walter, The football coach with 3 sons who spent 30 years not saying I'm proud of you. I thought about the son standing at the bedside waiting, and the oldest saying, "Dad, you can say it, whatever it is." I thought about Richard's notebook. Carol understood this one. The private record of the Times connection was real. I said, "Did your father keep anything? Write anything? Any record of the things that mattered to him?" She said, "He kept a journal. He kept it his whole adult life. My mother has it. She hasn't been able to open it yet." I said, "When she can, and she will be able to eventually. I think you should read it together, not immediately, but together." She was quiet. She said, "You think he wrote about me?" I said, "I think a man who kept a journal his whole adult life and who had a daughter he loved for 43 years wrote about his daughter." "Yes." She looked at the table. She said, "I'm afraid to find out what he wrote." I told her I understood that completely. That I had sat with Margaret's envelope for 6 days before I could open it. That the fear of what is in a thing is usually proportional to how much the thing matters. And that what was on the other side of the fear, in my experience, was almost never as terrible as the waiting. Usually it was a gift. The patient I thought about all morning. There was a man I treated in my 23rd year of emergency medicine. I'll call him Frank. He was 51 years old, and he had come in with his father, who was 77, and who had suffered a stroke that was serious, and whose outcome, in the first hours, was genuinely uncertain. Frank sat in the family consultation room, and he was, on the surface, entirely composed. He answered my questions clearly. He provided the medical history accurately. He signed the necessary forms without hesitation. He was functional in every way that the situation required him to be functional. And then, in a brief window, when we were alone in the room, he said something that has stayed with me across the years since. He said, "He never told me he was proud of me. Not once in 51 years. I don't even know if he is." He said it not with bitterness, with the flat, factual quality of a person stating something they have accepted as the weather of their relationship. "This is how it is. This is what I grew up in. This is the specific shape of the love I received, which expressed itself in provision and presence and protection, but not in language." I thought about what to say. I said, "Do you know that he isn't?" Frank looked at me. I said, "I mean specifically, do you have evidence that he is not proud of you? Or do you have the absence of evidence that he is?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I have the absence of evidence." I said, "Those are different things. And in my experience, the absence of language is more often about the person who can't find the words than about the feeling that is or isn't there." Frank's father survived the stroke. He had a significant recovery, limited but meaningful, enough to return home, enough to have what his family described as a good year before he died of unrelated causes 12 months later. I do not know whether Frank ever asked his father the question directly. I do not know whether his father said the thing in that final year that he had not said in the 51 years before. I hope he did. I think he probably did, because the stroke had done what medical crises sometimes do. Stripped away the assumption that the conversation could always happen later, and replaced it with the specific urgency of a window that might close. What I know is that Frank's question, "Do you have evidence that he isn't, or do you have the absence of evidence that he is one of the most useful questions I learned to ask in 40 years of being in those rooms. Because the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The father who never said "I love you" out loud may have felt it completely. The husband who never wrote the card may have kept track of every time his wife understood him. The parent who spoke in the language of provision and presence rather than verbal expression, may have carried in whatever interior register parents maintain a love so complete and so specific that the absence of the words was not the absence of the thing. The words matter. I want to be clear about that. I am not suggesting that unexpressed love is as good as expressed love, because it is not. Because the person on the receiving end of the unexpressed version does not have the same access to it and cannot carry it with the same certainty. The words matter. Dennis should have given Norma the card. Walter should have said it earlier. I should have been in the morning, instead of already at the hospital. The words matter, but their absence is not always what it appears to be from the outside. What Carol said when she came back. Carol returned from the other room and sat down and looked at her daughter, and then at me with the expression of a woman who understood that something had shifted in the room while she was gone. She said, "What did I miss?" Sarah said, "He told me my grief was the right size." Carol looked at me. I told her I had said something in that general direction. Carol said, "Good." She reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. The same gesture as before, the same wordless reaching that contained more than most sentences. I should have said it myself months ago. Sarah said, "You were busy grieving your husband." Carol said, "I can grieve my husband and notice that my daughter is hurting at the same time. I should have noticed sooner." Carol said, "I know. You're very good at hiding things. You learned it from your father." A small, complicated silence. Then Sarah said, "Dad hid things?" Carol said, "Your father had an entire interior life that he expressed primarily through engineering problems and oatmeal cookies." Yes, he hid things. She said it with the particular warmth of someone describing something they understood completely and loved anyway. He felt everything. He just needed a notebook to say it in. Sarah looked at her mother. She said, "Can I read the journal?" "When you're ready." Carol was quiet for a moment. She said, "When I'm ready." Yes, I think that was always the plan. Norma, who had been demonstrating extraordinary restraint for the better part of an hour, said, "That's a very healthy decision." Dennis had a journal too. I read 3 pages of it and closed it, because the first 3 pages were entirely about fantasy football, and I decided I didn't need to know more. Carol and Sarah both looked at her. Norma said, "Dennis was a complicated man." It was the first time she had laughed since she arrived. It was the real kind, the unexpected kind, the kind that surfaces when something breaks through the maintained composure and produces the involuntary response. She put her hand over her mouth. Slightly surprised by it, Carol said, "There you are." I recognized the phrase. Norma had said it to me 11 days after the funeral, when I laughed for the first time. There you are. The specific greeting of someone welcoming a person back into the room they had been standing outside of. There you are, what the Tuesday table has become. I want to step back from the specific conversation and tell you something about what has been building at this kitchen table over the past several weeks, because I think it contains something worth naming. When Margaret died, this kitchen was a place I moved through. I made 1 cup of coffee. I sat at the table with the newspaper I did not read. I existed in the house the way you exist in a waiting room. Present in the body, absent in everything else. Norma began coming on Tuesdays with food I had not requested, and the kitchen became a place where someone else was sometimes present. Then Carol came, and the table held 2 people in addition to Norma. Then Sarah today, making 4. The table has been growing, not because I planned it, not because I made a decision to reconstruct a social world around the grief. It happened the way most important things happen, through the specific, unremarkable accumulation of individual Tuesdays in which someone showed up and I let them in, and the conversation went somewhere real. What I have learned at this table, what I am continuing to learn, is something about the nature of the community that forms around loss when you allow it to form rather than managing it at a distance. It is not a community of people who share your specific grief. Carol's grief is not my grief. Sarah's is not Carol's. Norma lost Dennis 4 years ago, and her grief is different from all of ours in its shape and its stage, and the specific texture of who Dennis was versus who Margaret was versus who Richard was. What we share is not the content of the grief. We share the willingness to be in the room with it, to sit at a table where the absent ones are present in their absence, in the recipe cards and the notebooks and the journals and the fake succulents and the cookies that are getting closer to right, and to let that presence be part of the ordinary Tuesday rather than something to be managed away. That is what the table has become, and I want to tell you something about what it has done for me, because I think it is relevant to what I have been saying across these 9 videos about presence and connection and the cost of absence. It has made the ordinary days matter again, not in the way they mattered when Margaret was here. That is a different kind of mattering, specific to her and to the life we built, and I do not expect to replicate it, but in a way that is real and present and mine. The Tuesday mornings are something I move toward now rather than through. The table is a place I have built something at, not deliberately, not with a plan, but through the repeated choice to let people in. Margaret said in her letter, "I want you to have people at the table." Norma, obviously, she said it knowing what she was setting in motion. She was right about everything. She set exactly the right table. What I want you to hear before you go, I want to say 3 things directly. The first is for the Sarahs. If you are on the outside of someone else's loss, if you are the child, the sibling, the friend, the person whose grief is real but whose position in the hierarchy tells you to make it smaller, I want to tell you what I told Sarah this morning. Your grief is the right size, not larger than the grief of the person at the center of the loss. I am not asking you to compete. I am asking you to stop apologizing for the size of what you are carrying and to find the person or the place or the table where you can set it down without diminishing it. You are allowed to talk about the person you lost. You are allowed to cry when you think about them. You are allowed to be having a hard week 14 months later, or 2 years later, or 5 years later. The hierarchy tells you when your grief should be done. The grief does not read the hierarchy. And if you have said the wrong thing to someone who is grieving, if there is a sentence you cannot take back, delivered in the specific inadequacy of a person who loved someone and could not fix their pain and said the worst available thing because of it, go back. Say what Sarah said this morning. I said it because I was scared, not because I didn't love him. I said the wrong thing, and I know I said the wrong thing. That conversation, late as it may be, is still available. Go have it. The second thing is for the people who are holding someone's journal or notebook or box of letters or recipe card with the handwritten note. When you are ready, not before you are ready, but when you are, open it. I cannot tell you what you will find. I can tell you what I found in Margaret's envelope and what Carol suspects she will find in Richard's journal, and what Frank's father may or may not have written in whatever private record he kept of a life that included 51 years of a son. He may never have told directly what he felt. I can tell you that in my experience, across 40 years of being present at the end of lives and in the grief that follows them, the people who kept the records kept them because the feeling was real and large enough to require a container. The notebook exists because something needed to be said somewhere, even if it was never said out loud. Open it when you're ready. There is likely a gift inside. The third thing is the simplest. Come to your Tuesday. Whatever your Tuesday is, the regular coffee, the standing phone call, the dinner that happens every week or every month. The person you see reliably and have stopped fully seeing because they have become so reliably present that they register as background. Come to it with the quality of attention that Carol is learning to give, that Sarah is learning to accept, that Richard recorded in his margin when it happened, and that I failed to bring to enough mornings for enough years. Actually be there, not for a grand occasion, for a Tuesday. The Tuesday is the occasion. It always was. In the comments, I want to hear from you. Are you a Sarah, carrying a grief that the hierarchy tells you is not the right size? Tell me about it. And next week, Sarah said something as she was leaving that I have been thinking about since she walked out the door. She said she wanted to bring her daughter, the 9-year-old, the one who asks about Richard. She said, "My daughter keeps asking questions about her grandfather that I don't know how to answer. She wants to know where people go, whether he can see her, whether he knows she still thinks about him." She looked at me. She said, "Could I bring her? Would that be all right?" I told her it would be all right. I don't know yet what I will say to a 9-year-old who wants to know where people go, but I'll figure it out by Tuesday. My name is Dr. Edward Carver. I'll see you then.